Good evening, everyone. My name is Audrey Davis, and I'm the director of the Alexandria Black History Museum. Thank you for attending today's Alexandria Community Remembrance Project program. The Alexandria Community Remembrance Project, or ACRP, is a citywide initiative dedicated to helping Alexandria understand its history of racial terror, hate crimes, and work towards creating a welcoming community bound by equity and inclusion. Today, it gives me great pleasure to introduce LaNitra Berger, who is an award-winning scholar, educator, and social justice advocate working towards making higher education accessible to low-income, first-generation, and minority students. She's a senior director of fellowships in the Office of Undergraduate Education at George Mason University. Her scholarly interests are in art and social activism in the African and Jewish diasporas. Dr. Berger is the author of Exploring Education Abroad, a guide for racial and ethnic minority participants, and the monograph Irma Stern, The Racial Paradox of South African Modern Art, from the Audacities of Color series, 2020. She is also the editor of Social Justice and International Education, Research, Practice, and Perspectives. And Dr. Berger has earned her BA in Art and International Relations from Stanford University and an MA and PhD in Art History from Duke University. It now gives me great pleasure to turn our virtual podium over to Dr. LaNitra Berger. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Audrey, for that wonderful introduction. And thank you to all of you who have joined us today. I really want to thank Audrey for all of the work that she's doing in Alexandria City to promote Black history, but also to promote the work of racial healing in the city. And I'm so pleased to see so many members of the community who've joined us today, including some of my dear friends and colleagues. So thank you all for coming on a Thursday evening to listen to this talk. I'm very excited to talk about this book and to talk about Irma Stern and to introduce her to an American audience. And what I'm most excited about is having the opportunity to talk about Irma Stern with Rabbi Spinrad. So what I'm going to do is give you an introduction to Irma Stern and talk about her life and her work so that you have a visual frame of reference and you understand her biography. And then we'll bring in Rabbi Spinrad so that we can have a conversation about this very interesting artist who I think you all should know about, and I think more people should know about. And we can talk about some of the more interesting and controversial aspects of her biography and of her work. So with that, I'm going to share my screen and start my presentation. So I want to start with showing you a picture of Irma Stern and one of her paintings that she did in 1927 called Panda Woman. So Irma Stern was a South African Jewish artist of German heritage, and she spent much of her life painting in South Africa and specifically painting Black South Africans with a focus on Black women. And I became very curious about how this woman who came from German Jewish roots would become so interested in painting Black women. And that's the genesis of how I started this project. So first, I want to orient everyone to South Africa if you're not familiar with the country by showing you this map and pointing out some of the important parts of the country where Irma Stern came from. Stern was born in the Transvaal region of South Africa, which is in kind of the middle to northeastern part of the country. And she eventually, later in her life, settled in Cape Town, which is on the coast in the very far southwest of the country. And she traveled and exhibited very frequently in Johannesburg, which is where two of her friends lived. And if you think about the United States, there's New York City, which is seen to be the East Coast thriving metropolis. That's a really fast city that is also the center of the arts. And then Cape Town is similar to San Francisco, a West Coast city that's on the water that has a very different vibe. So those are the two cities that she kind of traveled back and forth between in her adult life. The picture on my left is a baby picture of Irma Stern. And I think this picture is really important to provide context of her work because not only does it show us what she looked like as a baby, but also she's being held up by a governess who's of Indian descent. And I think it's a really important thing to remember that from a young age, Irma Stern was exposed to and connected to people who looked very different from her. And I believe that that shaped her outlook, but also raises a lot of questions about some of the decisions that she made in her life and career. So Stern was born in 1894. She was born in South Africa. She grew up in this rural environment. Her parents owned a general store, and she had a very rural existence, but her family had money. And they would spend time on the eastern coast of South Africa visiting the beach, and she would be amongst lots of different Black populations there, interacting with them. But the Boer War broke out, which was the war between the Dutch descendant Afrikaners and the British. And her family had to leave their home, and they went to Cape Town. And while they were refugees in Cape Town, there was an outbreak of the plague, and they then left Cape Town and moved to moved to Germany, where they settled, and Irma was able to attend art school in Weimar. So she was able to get an art education there. She had the opportunity to enjoy all the trappings of a good life in Berlin. She went to the theater. She went to exhibitions. She was able to paint. She was able to go to the opera. She read lots of books. And she also had to stay in Germany during the First World War. She was not able to return to South Africa. So while she was in Germany during the war, she noticed many soldiers returning from war. She noticed the devastation that the war was causing in Europe. And she did this painting called The Eternal Child in 1916. And she says that she created this painting after seeing a young child riding a tram by herself and looking very distraught. So this is one of the first examples of her looking at her surroundings and taking in her surroundings and incorporating what she saw going on in the world into her paintings. She had a family friend who knew a German artist named Max Pechstein, who was able to introduce her to Pechstein. And Pechstein saw this painting that she did, The Eternal Child, and said, I think you've got talent and I'd like to mentor you. So this is a picture of Max Pechstein, and this is an example of some of Pechstein's work. The reason why the Stern-Pechstein connection is so important is that, number one, Pechstein was also interested in other places outside of Europe. So this is a time when modern art was in its early stages in Europe. And so much of the questions that modern artists were asking was, how does Europe interact with other cultures, people in other places? And so Pechstein was actually able to live in the South Seas island of Palau for a little while. And this is an example of one of those paintings. And so he was able to live in this place until the war broke out and really start to understand what it was like to be a European artist living in another country. On the flip side, there are lots of examples of African sculpture that were coming to Europe and to European museums through European colonialism. So European artists who couldn't leave the continent were going to ethnographic museums and looking at African sculptures there. And so Pechstein was actually doing both. You see an image of him trying to incorporate African sculptural techniques in this woodcut. And then you also see a painting that he did of Palau. So he was very curious about someone like Stern, who was born in South Africa on the African continent. That was very unique at the time. So they really connected between these areas of commonality, and Pechstein became her mentor. They had a lifelong correspondence. Pechstein would write her letters, and he would encourage her and say that she had a lot of talent. And she really took a lot of her early stylistic cues from Pechstein. Most importantly, as well, as Pechstein was involved in social movements in Germany. He was very interested in class conflict and class warfare and having artists weigh in on that. So she was connected to an artist who was very much interested in the social aspects of art from the beginning of her career. So Pechstein actually introduced Stern to his art dealer, Wolfgang Gerlit. And Gerlit owned one of the most famous modern art galleries, and he actually was the one who paid for Pechstein to go to Palau. And this was an important relationship because eventually Stern would sign on with Gerlit, and Gertrude would exhibit some of her work. So the work that you see on my far left, Duma la Morena, this is the cover image of that lithograph series, in which Stern was commissioned to paint her impressions and her memories of her childhood in Africa. And so I put these three together because you can see how her work is evolving as an artist throughout the 20s. And you can see how different her paintings are for different audiences. So Duma la Morena was commissioned by a European modern art gallery dealer for a primarily European audience. Three Swazi Women, an Indian family, were works that she created in South Africa for a primarily South African audience. So there's a level of specificity that's very different between these different types of works. So in 1920, Irma Stern left Germany and returned to South Africa. And by that point, she was a young adult, and she wanted to establish herself as an artist. And, you know, that seems kind of mundane and benign to us right now, but back then, for a woman who was at the time unmarried, to move to South Africa and establish herself as an artist, that was her business, was really unheard of. It was very difficult for women to do that. So that was a big deal. And she returned to Cape Town, which was much more boring than Berlin. The sidewalks rolled up at 6 p.m. There was not a lot of nightlife. She described Cape Town as like a soda water that had lost its fizz. And so she felt like a real fish out of water, having spent so much time in Berlin. So when she came, and she brought this new interest in not only painting Black South Africans, but as you see, Indian South Africans and other South Africans, that was well received in Europe. South Africans were less interested in the types of painting that she was doing, this modern style that she had developed while she was in Germany. They were much more conservative. They were interested in landscapes, and particularly those that did not represent Black people as the primary subjects of the paintings. And so Stern encountered a lot of friction in terms of being able to exhibit and in terms of the reception of her work. At the same time, she somehow connected and was known to other thinkers around the world who were also trying to understand this modernist moment where our world was expanding and people from other cultures were able to connect through boats and through correspondence and through this exchange of cultures. And so somehow her work came to the attention of an African-American thinker named Elaine Locke, who was a known Black philosopher, cultural critic, and thinker in the United States. And at the time, for Blacks in the United States, the only way that they could really fully pursue their education was for them to travel and study in Europe. So Elaine Locke was actually the first Black Rhodes Scholar in the United States, and he was able to study in Oxford and in Berlin. Many Black thinkers got their early educational start by studying abroad in Germany. So Elaine Locke, W.E.B. Du Bois, and many others had traveled through Germany and studied there. So Locke had spent some time in Berlin. He was very interested in German colonialism and German colonial encounters with Black people, and he became intrigued by Stern's work. Locke actually was very close to a German painter named Winold Reiss, who painted a portrait of Locke in 1925. And in that same year, Locke published his seminal work, The Negro, an Interpretation. And this is still seen as one of the most important texts in African-American literature, culture, and studies, because in it, Locke lays out an argument that artists need to use their mediums to address social issues. And he calls on Black artists to really think about how their work can be in the service of racial justice and the pursuit of racial equality. The really important thing about what Locke was doing was that he heavily relies on his time in Germany to talk about German artists and thinkers who were doing this work. And he names Irma Stern as one of those artists. He erroneously refers to her as Elaine Stern, but he mentions her in a list of other artists, including Max Pechstein. So he had seen Stern's work. He had seen her depictions of Black people, and he actually found something liberating in what she was doing, so much so that he was actually asking, in his essay called The Legacy of the Ancestral Arts, he was asking Black scholars to look at Irma Stern's work and use it as an example of how they could represent African people. So it's very interesting what's going on globally in the 20s and how these artists are connected, even though they're thousands of miles apart from each other. So as Stern is establishing herself in South Africa in the 20s, she became very immersed and an intrinsic part of South Africa's Jewish community in Cape Town. So Cape Town had a small but very active Jewish community, and she joined it very quickly. She participated in Purim celebrations and cultural events, and she made a lot of friends there. And these are two portraits of two of Stern's best friends, Hilda Pravitzky and Rosa van Haldoran. Now, these two ladies actually deserve their very own biographies because they are both fascinating and were groundbreaking in their own right. They were life partners. They were not allowed to marry each other in South Africa at the time, but they lived together for their lives. And they actually ran a girls' school that was a school for colored or mixed race girls. And they believed in integration, and they believed that girls deserved an equal education, which was also something that was not the prevailing thought of the time. So these were two of Stern's very best friends. And in addition to running the school, they did all kinds of things, but Hilda Pravitzky in particular was an art critic for the local Jewish newspaper. And so they supported Irma Stern's exhibitions. They helped her find people to buy her work and her paintings. And they also wrote about her work in these publications. And Pravitzky was actually one of the forerunners, the primary people who wrote and spoke about what should modern art in South Africa look like, and even more specifically, what does Jewish modern art look like in South Africa? And she posited a couple of things. Number one was Jewish art that only depicted Jewish people and Jewish subjects like life cycle events and Jewish cultural symbols, or was Jewish art that embraced the concept of tikkun olam, or repairing the world? So if an artist is addressing social issues in their work, does that constitute modern art and modern Jewish art? And so Stern really spoke to her in this context. Pravitzky felt that Stern, in painting Black women in particular, was raising very important issues in the country and making observations about the country that were not made by men and by people who were not Jewish. And so she really felt that Stern played an important role in having that public debate and discussion. So these two women were really influential throughout Stern's life in terms of supporting her work. Later on, it would become consequential during the apartheid era, as Stern was really more troubled with how she was trying to understand racial issues. Now, there's a third or two more people who were really important in Stern's life who are also part of the Jewish community. And those are her friends, Frida and Richard Feldman. And you see a picture of them on my left, and then you see a portrait that Irma Stern did of Frida Feldman in 1943. So Frida and Richard Feldman were based in Johannesburg. So they lived, there's about 700 miles between Cape Town and Johannesburg. And Johannesburg was a town that was built on the discovery of gold and diamonds and other minerals. So it sprang up overnight when these minerals were discovered, and it became very wealthy and very popular very quickly. So it's a much more urban environment. Feldman had actually immigrated to South Africa as a young boy from Russia. So his family was escaping anti-Semitism and the pogroms in Russia. And so his family was Yiddish speaking. He was very observant. He came from an observant family. And in South Africa, as is the case in other places, there were lots of dividing lines between the Jewish community, which was a very complex and very diverse community within itself. And so Feldman was deeply committed and disturbed by the social issues that he saw in Johannesburg in the mines. He saw that Black people were considered to be disposable in the mines, that they were dying at disproportionate rates, that they were paid pennies to other people who were working in the mines. And he was very disturbed about this and spoke about it very frequently. And really for the rest of his life, he was very outspoken about racism, about apartheid, about colonialism. And he spent a lot of time raising awareness about these issues. So much so that he actually wrote a book in Yiddish called Black and White. And these were stories of the mines and the social and economic conditions in the mines. So, Feldman was very influential in South Africa because of his outspokenness. And he actually used one of Irma Stern's paintings that you see on the other side of the page to be the cover image of the title page of this book. So they struck up a very quick friendship and became lifelong friends. And there was also this symbiotic relationship where Stern's interest in painting Black people also fed in with Feldman's interest in raising awareness of the social and racial conditions that he was observing in South Africa. So in addition, Stern painted many members of the Jewish community. In my book, I have a chapter devoted to Stern's interactions and friendships within the Jewish community. But I feel like in itself, it could probably be a whole book because, as I mentioned, the Jewish community was very diverse. People had very different views and experiences, and they were coming from all over the world at different points. And one of the things that they had in common was that they were all escaping anti-Semitism in some way. So Stern actually did this other portrait of another very famous Jewish South African, someone I would argue is Stern's literary counterpart, Sarah Gertrude Millen. And many people are not very aware of Irma Stern, but they have heard of Sarah Gertrude Millen because she wrote several famous novels, one of which was called God's Stepchildren. And Millen was a Jewish South African, but she's of Lithuanian descent. And she, was very, very observant and of race relations in South Africa. But she also had some very controversial views. She was very against the idea of miscegenation and of Black people mixing. She, embraced some of the eugenicist ideas of Black people. And so she fell into a lot of controversy during her life as well. But it's really interesting to see how Stern is really documenting and capturing these many different types of Jewish people in South Africa. So Stern became much more well-known in the 1930s. In the 20s, she really struggled as an artist. She was slowly building up a reputation. She eventually got married and was able to move out of her house and establish her independence. And by the 1930s, South Africa as a country was starting to want to connect itself back to its European roots from the standpoint of the white settlers who were there. And so the country as a whole started to embrace more of the modern trends than they had initially when Stern first moved back to South Africa. So throughout the 30s, she started to become much more of a respected artist. During that time as well, she was traveling back and forth between South Africa and Europe by boat. So we think that, a 6 or 7 hour plane ride is long. Imagine taking a boat ride from Cape Town to Paris or to London and doing that several times a year. So Stern was going back and forth to Europe. She was exhibiting all throughout Europe, in Germany and Austria and Paris and other places. Europeans were very interested in this woman who was both South African but understood Europe very well. South Africans were very interested in Stern as somebody who knew Europe but also knew South Africa. But in 1933, she recognized that the rise of Nazism would make it dangerous for her to continue traveling there. So she stopped traveling to Europe. And as we all know, shortly after, the World War II broke out and she was confined to the African continent. So as someone who was very dedicated to movement and travel and exploring other places, what did she do? She rented a car and she drove from South Africa to what was then known as the Belgian Congo. So in 1942, she traveled by car. She had a car full of gifts that she was going to use to try to get people to agree to let her paint them. And she ended up in what is now modern day Rwanda and Burundi. And while she was there, she met with a lot of different types of people. She was had encounters with the Tutsi people and did lots of paintings and drawings there. And what she produced was this book called Congo, which is a book is a real understatement of what it is. It's a work of art, and it's a very beautiful illustrated artist book that has rich textured textiles, as you can see from this cover image here. In the middle, I have a page from Congo where you can see how the drawing is superimposed onto a reproduction of Kuba textiles. And so each page is just brimming with artistic richness. But one of the things that I think is really interesting is that Stern actually starts to write in Congo that she's so enamored with the Tutsis. She's read anthropological accounts and histories of the region that describe these regal Tutsi people who are very tall and thin and majestic. But so she writes about this, but then she also talks about what she calls the servants, who are shorter people, that she describes as being ugly. And those people are known as Bahutus. So she talks about her observations of the conflicts between the two, and that one group is treating the other group poorly. And unfortunately, what she's observing is actually the ethnic conflict between the Hutus and Tutsis that would eventually result in the Rwandan genocide in 1994. And in fact, one of the queens who was murdered in that genocide in her 80s at that time is somebody that Stern had met and painted while she was in the Congo. So it's very interesting that this artist who was born in 1894, her life corresponds with many of the most important and significant historical moments in the 20th century across continents. So in Europe, in South Africa, in the United States. So just a really interesting ways in which her life and biography are superimposed over global politics and history. So Stern really liked this idea of traveling around the African continent. So in 1948, she did another artist book called Zanzibar. She went and traveled there, took a boat and did a very similar book in Zanzibar, in which she painted and drew images of the Arab community there. And so this is a really special time in her work because she was leaving South Africa, but she was painting a very different part of the African continent. And the 40s are also the time when South Africa started to turn towards apartheid, which was the system in which the white minority ruled the Black majority and developed a system of oppression that was brutal and violent. And so Stern was away from South Africa at this time and was trying to make sense of what was happening in South Africa while painting other parts of the African continent. So that being said, Stern became a very well-known and high demand artist at that time. She, the South African government saw that somebody like Stern would be a very important person to send overseas. If as they were forming the basis of apartheid, they knew that people in other countries might consider this idea of a white minority rule as being wrong and controversial. So they were looking for artists like Stern to soften it in many ways and to show that they did have artists who traveled. They did have artists who painted Black people or painted across the color line. So Stern made the acquaintance of General Jan Smuts, whose picture you see here. And he himself was also very international. He had a degree and had studied in Cambridge. And he had a role in forming the League of Nations. He also played a very important role in the formation of apartheid in South Africa. And so Smuts provided Stern with letters of transit And he made it possible for her to travel to Europe and exhibit in the 40s and 50s. And this was a time when they were making it much harder for South Africans to leave the country. So the idea was that if you could travel internationally, you might see other ways of doing things, and you might say, I don't know if apartheid is a good way of doing things in South Africa. So Smuts allowed Stern to travel, and she was in fact supported by the South African government. Her work was purchased to hang in embassies. She was part of state-sponsored exhibitions. She was selected to represent South Africa in various biennales throughout the world. And so she enjoyed a lot of financial support from people who were buying her work. And she also enjoyed a lot of government support for her work. So there was a very strong connection there. In addition to that, Stern herself felt that she did not like the idea of integration. She was a part of that system that believed that people should be separate. So despite having traveled as much as she did, she balked when she went to Senegal, and there was no segregated facilities, no segregated bathrooms, no segregated water fountains. And she notes that she feels that this is disturbing, and says that anybody in South Africa who's questioning the color line should go to Senegal, and maybe they would appreciate segregated South Africa even more. So despite having all of this experience traveling and the ways in which she was interacting and painting Black people, she still ultimately believed that Black people should maintain an inferior place in South African society. So as apartheid was becoming solidified, it actually made it much harder for Stern to travel throughout South Africa. Part of the apartheid system was to drive Black people into urban areas for work purposes, but keep them in townships that were very, very dilapidated. The housing was overcrowded, and to take them outside of the rural areas. And so Stern really struggled to travel to these areas because there were people, mostly were concentrated in the big cities, and people were angry about apartheid. So people were less receptive to a white woman coming into their area and wanting to be painted. So I put these two paintings up so you can kind of see how her work is evolving over that time period. So in 1941, she traveled and to the Eastern Cape and painted a woman called Xhosa Woman, who that's an ethnic group in South Africa. That's actually Nelson Mandela's ethnic group. And so she painted this woman in her traditional ethnic clothing. And then she did this painting in 1955, which is really at the height of some of the social protests of apartheid. And this painting is called Made in Uniform. This is one of the only paintings that Stern did of a woman in an urban environment. So she's usually painting women in rural environments that are not really connected to a specific place. You can tell by the way they're dressed, what ethnic group they're part of, but there's not a lot of other markers. But this is one of the only paintings that Stern did of someone in an urban context. And I think that it's compelling to see the date of 1955. There are women protesting at the Capitol, Black women protesting their social conditions. There are protests organized by the ANC, the African National Congress, the PAC, the Pan-Africanist Conference. Nelson Mandela at that point is a rising figure within the ANC and the anti-apartheid movement. So there's a lot of anger about apartheid in South Africa. And you can see on this woman's face, not only is she wearing a domestic uniform, which tells you a lot about what her social condition was, but she is clearly unhappy both to sit for this painting and also for her social circumstances. So there's a lot of evolution that occurs as apartheid was implemented in 1948. So in the last 20 years of her life, Stern was really frustrated by this, and she traveled back and forth, mostly spent a lot more time in Europe. She unfortunately had uncontrolled diabetes, and so her health was really not good in the last 20 years of her life. And she spent a lot of time in Mediterranean climates, both relaxing and convalescing, but also painting there. I think that it was very difficult for her to travel throughout South Africa, and because the reception of her was not very favorable, she became very turned off by being able to travel there and just preferred to be in Europe at that time. And but yet her star continued to rise. She was very successful as an artist. She had a very nice house in Cape Town. She had the ability to do all that traveling. All of her work was exhibited. But you know, her friends, who were her friends to the end, Hilda Pravitzky, Rosa van Haldoran, and particularly Richard Feldman, became very staunch anti-apartheid activists. They were very involved in causes that stood up against apartheid. And they frequently asked Stern and challenged her ideas when she put forth ideas that were racist. They challenged her on that. And in fact, Frida Feldman asked her if she would donate a painting to the treason trial, which was a trial where Nelson Mandela was tried and for his anti-apartheid activism. And she gave a painting, she gave one painting, but when they came back to her and asked her for another, she said, no, I don't want to be involved in that. So she kept a distance from that type of political activity, even though she was part of a community that was speaking out against apartheid, and Jewish South Africans were disproportionately involved in the anti-apartheid movement. Now, that's not to say that every Jewish person in South Africa was anti-apartheid. The community, as I mentioned before, was very diverse and had very differing views on how to exist in apartheid era South Africa. There was a very strong contingent of Jews in South Africa who wanted to take a stance that was a non-committal stance about apartheid. And that meant that they did not want to condone it, but they did not want to condemn it either. And many of them gave the reason that they had gotten to South Africa by escaping escaping anti-Semitism and violence in other countries. So they were concerned that they would draw attention to the community and that they would again be subjected to violence. So there was a section of the Jewish community who wanted to stay out of it for that reason. There were others, though, who said, we are compelled by our religion to speak out against injustice. And so even if there is a cost to us as individuals, our religion tells us that we must speak out against injustice. And so I think that that's a really interesting bifurcation of the community. And I think that it has a lot of implications for where we are now as a culture here in the US. There's a lot of cross-cultural connections between those two, and a lot for us to think about. So Stern died in 1966 at the age of 71. Her house became a museum in 1971. And so you see a picture here of me with my students inside of the Irma Stern Museum. The museum is a living, breathing memorial to Irma Stern. You can visit the museum in Cape Town. You can see the studio where she died, and or you can see the studio as left when she died, including the last painting that she was working on, which I think is very important. But Stern her legacy in South Africa is mixed. Her work sells for millions at auction. She was prolific. She did paintings, sculptures, drawings, watercolors, lithographs. She did everything across the genres. And she painted all kinds of people, Black, colored, Muslim, Jewish. So she painted South Africa in its true diversity. But as South Africa has been working through its own racial reckoning, 25, approaching 30 years after apartheid, Black South Africans are wondering, what has really changed for us? We don't live in ideal conditions. We still live in many of the townships where we lived during apartheid. We still don't have access to equal opportunity. Why are we talking about this Jewish woman artist when there are Black artists who were not afforded any opportunities? So that is part of this larger discussion about Stern's legacy, but also many of the monuments and memorials in South Africa that commemorate colonizers and racist politicians. So as you see here in the middle, This is a photo of the removal of the Cecil Rhodes statue at the University of Cape Town in 2015. The man that you see on my left, Chumani Maxwele, was a student at the University of Cape Town, and he passed that statue every day and went home to a township where people don't have running water and they use porta potties. And he wondered, why am I still doing this? And yet this person, who is the cause of much of the underlying reasons for apartheid, memorialized in the center of campus. And so he took a bucket of excrement from one of those porta potties and threw it on the statue. And that statement began this reckoning and this conversation about the placement of these monuments and memorials throughout South Africa, in a country that has overcome apartheid in some ways, but not in every way. So Chumani actually spoke with my students when I taught my class, and I brought my students there. I had them meet Chumani. We went to the place where the statue was. I had them talking to people across the spectrum about this question of public monuments and memorials. And I think that that's one of the big reasons why my work is part of this series, and why I've been having these great conversations with Audrey, is because we live in Alexandria, Virginia, a state that was part of the Confederacy. We also have monuments and memorials to the Confederacy, to people who were avid supporters of slavery and owned people and enslaved people themselves. And we have to reckon with our feelings about having these people memorialized in these public spaces. You know, it says something a lot about our past, but it also is something for us to think about and understand for the future of our city as well. And so much of these conversations have been very robust conversations, as you can see all of the people who came to see the statue removed. We saw this in 2020 in Richmond. So I think that we are having similar conversations across the Atlantic Ocean, and it's really important for us to really think about how we look at these monuments and memorials, and how we think about artists like Irma Stern, who had a very privileged position, who had access to travel, who had access to resources, who saw the diversity of South Africa and painted the diversity of South Africa, but still ultimately was okay with the status quo being racial segregation. So there's a lot to consider about an artist like that. And at this point, I'm going to end my remarks there. So I'm going to stop my share because that's the end of my presentation. And I'd love to now talk with Rabbi Spinrad.
LaNitra, thank you for a great lecture. We are so pleased that you were able to join us tonight for another wonderful lecture. And I'd like to take this moment before we take questions, and to remind people to please put questions in our audience, to please put questions in the chat. But I'd like to introduce our moderator tonight, who is Rabbi David Spinrad of Beth El Hebrew Congregation. Rabbi Spinrad is guided by the congregation's mission to be a sacred Jewish community for all who seek connection, meaning, and healing. He finds joy in helping the historic Alexandria congregation grow as a center of vibrant Jewish living and learning in Northern Virginia. And Rabbi Spinrad serves on the Board of Trustees for Alexandria's Community Foundation Act for Alexandria, and it's on its Racial Equity Committee. And he is also a beloved member of our ACRP Steering Committee, and he chairs its Soil and Marker Committee. So it gives me great pleasure to introduce Rabbi Spinrad, who will enter into discussion with LaNitra. Thank you.
Thank you, Audrey. Really, thank you, Dr. Berger. What a terrific lecture, and what an incredible subject. I've become a lot more familiar with the life and work and see of Irma Stern than I once was, and the more I learn about her life and her context, just to be honest, the more I just hear the echoes and the parallels of what it means to be, I'm a Jew of Ashkenazi descent. So I can say I'm not white all I want, but I sure get all the attendant benefits of whiteness. So for the sake of this, I'm white. And for the sake of most situations, I'm white. So I'm hearing the echoes, and in the book, Irma Stern and the Racial Paradox of South African Art, you talk about two paradoxes, and I was hoping we actually could start with those, if that's all right. That first one is Stern's interest is kind of even a mild word, right? Her devotion to Black subjects. Yet she certainly seemed less interested in their condition, in their equality, in their humanity, and that's like I think about in this country, the highest pedestal, in my opinion, is Black culture. Black culture is venerated, and it's also, unfortunately, oftentimes seen as disposable. We just churn through it, but they are the greatest cultural icons. I would just love to I don't understand Irma Stern, and yet I guess I don't understand the context in which I'm living either. Then.
Yeah, this is another kind of interesting way in which the United States and South Africa have something in common, because there's an obsession, as you said, with Black culture and the consumption of Black culture and the products of Black people. But when it comes to, can you live next to a Black person? Can you be friends with a Black person? Can you extend humanity to a Black person? That's a different story. The thing about paradoxes is that they're oftentimes unresolved, and that's what makes us so uncomfortable, is that we can't see a way out of them. How can we get out of treating Black people this way and still appreciate their culture? And I'm not sure that we've really gotten out of that, and how we can get out of that. And then, this secondary paradox that I was writing about was exactly what you said at the beginning about your own identity, is the paradox of whiteness in the Jewish community. How can you have white skin, but also be subjected to discrimination and violence? And, Jewish South Africans really grappled with that significantly. And I read just very interesting historical accounts of Jewish people feeling very conflicted about having hired help, but also knowing that, they had family members who were trapped in Europe during the war, and, that they had come from pogroms in other places, and the ways in which they were treated. So that was something that I think was a really important aspect of the book, that I think those two things really do go hand in hand. And that's why oftentimes where you see Black cultural production, you do see Jewish people somehow involved, either in support or in helping with creating those cultural products, because of that shared interest. But even with that, there's friction because of the way that we think about skin color as a dividing line.
Yeah, well, beautifully said. I'm thinking about, in our American context, that there is you use the word friction. There is a willingness to extend ourselves only so far, right? And not wanting to, white Jews not wanting or being very reluctant to expose ourselves and put ourselves at risk in order to help another. Now, one thing I think is really interesting in our context, I'm not as familiar with the South African context, is that to think that Jews are white is incorrect, right? That Moses was brown. All of the characters in the Bible, they were not from Eastern Europe, right? But in here, and also I know that I forget the one who was not so good. She was from one of them. No, not the anti-miscegenation. The couple. One of them was Sephardi, but I know that most of the Jews are of Ashkenazi in South Africa, right?
Yes,
Right.
yes, that's correct. So Rosa van Haldoran was Sephardic.
Yes.
She came from Holland and she was
Yes.
of the Sephardic community, but Hilda Pravitzky was Ashkenazi of Lithuanian descent.
Right, right. What I want to ask you kind of as a follow-up, in this country, I just actually, let me not make it abstract. In my own work, in working towards trying to help lead a congregation towards anti-racism, one of the arguments I put forward is that it is actually in our self-interest that at least 13% of North American Jewry identifies as Jews of color. And I know that that's it's starting to take hold. But one of the things I've noticed here is that it's hard to sustain doing the right thing indefinitely when it's not in a person's self-interest. And I'm wondering in allyship in South Africa, or moving forward in time, moving in like into the 50s, how did the Ashkenazi Jewish communities, how did they show up as allies?
Yeah, I love that you ask about allies because this is part of the research that I'm really committed to. And in my work at George Mason University, I'm doing I do workshops on allyship and I train students to think about allyship. So the Jewish community initially, hi.
This is Dr. Berger.
Hi, Dr. Berger.
Hi, it's nice to see you.
Nice.
Let me do my thing, Bobby. Can I? Sorry.
That's okay. I have a 10-year-old who might show up as well. So they, initially, they were really not welcomed in South Africa. South Africa had embraced Nazism in a lot of ways. And so they were extremely marginalized and discriminated against. And it was only when South Africa was trying to lay the foundations for apartheid that they started to realize how much in the minority white people were, and that they needed Jews to piece together the 4% that they would eventually become. Yeah. And so then suddenly Jews became white.
Yes.
And so they had this experience where they were outsiders, and then almost overnight they were considered to be insiders, but they knew why they were considered to be insiders, and they were on the whole uncomfortable with that. So allyship I would say in many ways, allyship in South Africa during apartheid is a model for other places in terms of how Jewish people showed up for Black people. Joe Slovo, for example, Helen Suzman, there are many people in South Africa in the Jewish community who put their lives on the line for the cause. And that's not always what people are willing to do. And, one of the things I say about social justice work is that it's costly, it's not free. It's not just out there, with a t-shirt or putting something on Twitter. There are real costs to it. Sometimes people pay with their lives, but people lose their jobs. They get ostracized from communities because they're speaking up on behalf of someone else. And there were Jewish South Africans who did that, and things became very complicated as the state of Israel was founded, and Jewish South Africans were sending the largest amount of remittances to Israel. The state of Israel was being created, but at the same time, there were many Black South Africans who eventually in the 60s and 70s started to ally with the Palestinians, more so with the Jews. It became very complex, but at the end of the day, you still had a sizable number of Jewish people who believed that apartheid was wrong and did what they could with the means that they had to state that it was wrong and to work towards social change.
This is such a fun conversation.
I know.
Really. I want to circle back a little bit earlier in Irma Stern's career to talk about Van Haldoran and Pravitzky, right? And I wanted to ask you about your thoughts on the role of the Jewish artist. What is the role of the Jewish artist?
So I was really intrigued by this idea that Pravitzky was posing, and I thought it was just so interesting and insightful that in the 20s that she would make this statement. I mean, it's a minor publication in Cape Town in the 20s, but I really feel like she set the tone and really could prefaced what was going to happen in the country as the decades unfolded. And I think it's a question that we can ask at any point in time, in any country, in any time period. You know, what is Jewish art? What is Black art? Black people were having the same conversation. Is Black art that depicts Black subjects and racial subjects and Black history? Or is an abstract artist like, you know, like Sam Gilliam, you know, that's still Black art because it's painted by a Black artist. Yes. Same kind of conversation in the Jewish community. And so I really think that both are possible, that any way in which you're using your identity and your upbringing and your background to either interpret the world around you, which is what artists are doing. You know, that's what Monet is doing in painting the water lilies. You know, they're painting what they see. And unfortunately, much of South African art up to that point was leaving out important parts of what they saw. So you see these landscape paintings that have no people in them intentionally because the artist did not want to show that Black people were there. And so you have someone like Stern, who's the background is one thing, it's the Black people who are at the center. And that was what was so disruptive to her presence. And so I think that's Jewish art. That is an artist whose background and identity is compelling them to paint what they see.
Beautiful. It's interesting, like part of that paradox, especially when you get to Made in Uniform, which is, it's the cover of your book, right?
Yes.
Right. So it seems like she's pushing South Africa to talk about race and class, and yet it's almost like she should turn the mirror on herself a little bit, because she also seems like maybe she's painting this, but not necessarily being moved in her own thoughts and ways to respond to the things she's provoking. So, and I've been thinking about this. I mean, she's a brilliant artist. She's not unconscious about her paintings and the feelings that they would evoke in her audience. It's not incidental. When she paints that Made in Uniform, it's a statement. Yeah.
Yes. That's why I chose this painting as the cover image. There are so many books about Irma Stern that come out of South Africa, and they're beautiful books that are really interesting. But they're usually, they pick something that she's done of a woman in a rural environment or one of her hundreds of still lives. And there's this one painting, Made in Uniform, that no one really talks about. That painting happens to be hanging in the Irma Stern Museum. And so when I was doing the research for the book, I lived in Cape Town down the street from the museum, and every day I would go to the museum and they would bring out the files for me, and I would sit at Irma Stern's 17th century dining room table and read through the files and look at that painting. And I thought it was a beautiful painting. It spoke to me in ways that the other paintings didn't. And it took me a very long time to figure out why. If you look at the historical information of the time, you know, Stern's always asked if she's a political artist, or different people talk about whether or not she's a political artist. And sometimes she would say, no, I'm not political. Or sometimes predominantly male critics would say that she was not political, you know, which I think was a sexist move. But how all of us are political in ways, because we're all living in a community and in a social environment. And so there's no way that she wasn't thinking socially and politically in painting this woman in 1955 at the height of the protests, painting this woman in a maid's uniform, when Black women were at the centerpiece of white family culture. You know, Black women were raising the white children. They were making it possible for white women to have
Yeah.
the social lives that they had. So that it was clearly political. But what spoke to me, it finally just kind of all came together, was that I come from a long line of domestics myself. You know, my grandmother was a domestic in Alabama. And the look on this woman's face, and when I think about the lineage of my own family and the women in my family, I was connecting in a way that spoke to me because of that painting. And so she's not only capturing this very specific moment in South Africa, but she's capturing a global moment.
Yes.
Where Black women were subjugated, where they were subservient in many ways, but that very difficult contested relationship between Black and white women, as both are trying to achieve liberation in many ways. You know, she's really capturing that in that work.
Wow, absolutely. I look at that painting and I think, oh, it could have been Montgomery, or that could have been Chicago. And yeah, 100%. The last chapter of your book, you feature 4 Black South African artists, which is such a beautiful way to end the book. Will you talk about that choice to conclude your book, and maybe talk a little bit about the artists themselves?
Yes. And so what I would like to do actually is I'm going to reshare, because I have a slide that shows these artists and their names. I'm trying to be very vocal about naming, since many of Stern's works do not specifically name Black women,
Yes.
but she's very specific about naming the white people that she painted. And so I'm going to show you that this image here, you can see. So, you know, I wanted my book to be different than all the other books that were written about Irma Stern. And one of the things that I thought would be important would be to show the work of young Black South African artists, and to pass the torch to them and give them an opportunity to have a platform and to have a voice. And so while I was in South Africa in 2018, there was a show called the Turbine Art Fair that features young Black artists every year. And they have a special part of that show where they pick an older South African artist and they ask these artists to create work in response to that artist. And so I think part of this was divinely appointed, because the year that I was there, Irma Stern was that senior artist.
That's cool.
So these 4 artists created work in response to learning about Irma Stern and her biography and looking at examples of her work. So I had the chance to meet some of these artists and to interview them and talk to them about their views. And the conversations did not go as you might predict. Like, I think some people might think that maybe they were angry or they disliked Irma Stern. And that's not really the overarching thing that I took away from these conversations. These artists are all extremely talented. Their names are Duduzile Moore, David Madlabane, Thuli Lubisi, and Pule Rotsoma. And they're all based in the Johannesburg and Pretoria area. They're all young, and they're part of a generation of Black South Africans called the Born Free generation. So instead of having people called millennials or Gen Z, Born Frees are people who were born after the end of apartheid. And so they're all the Born Free generation. One of them might be just a little bit older. And so I interviewed them all and asked them, you know, what do you think of Irma Stern? You know, how did she influence your work? And for the most part, they were very intrigued and in some ways inspired by Stern's story. They were connecting to aspects of the obstacles that she had to overcome as a young woman artist in the 20s. They found that to be inspiring. The fact that she was able to travel so much, they thought that that was really, really interesting and inspiring. Her use of color, they found to be inspiring. And, you know, one of them, Duduzile, who goes by Dudu, she mentioned that she had a question about consent and whether or not Stern got consent from the women that she painted which I thought was a really insightful question, and gets to how she really thought about the people she painted. But by and large, they were very inspired by Stern and her work. They did place her into historical context, so they did talk about that she was a product of her time, is sometimes how people talk about the ways in which people thought about Black people at that time. But I had these just incredible conversations with them, and their work is amazing. They all work and have trained in this place called the Artist Proof Studio. And so you can buy their work online, and it ships very quickly to the United States. And so I've tried to support them with, the limited resources that I have. I've tried to buy their artwork and give them an audience and a voice, because they really are the future of South Africa, and they really are the artists that we should be looking to for inspiration. And so I ended the book that way, because I didn't want to just end it with another book that says, Irma Stern is so interesting and phenomenal. Let's make her paintings worth even more than they already are. I wanted there to be a young Black voice at the end of the book.
Awesome. So cool. From your mention of Locke and him pointing towards Germany during the Harlem Renaissance as a source of study and inspiration for Black representation, right, at the times, and where he thought the direction should be heading, and also knowing a little bit, doing a little homework, I was wondering if you might tell us about the new project that you're working on.
Yeah. So I've been interested in Elaine Locke since I was a kid. My mother was an antiquarian book dealer, and she had a copy of the Survey Graphic journal that eventually became the New Negro. And so since I was a kid, I was just really interested in who Locke was. So he's been a part of my life for a very long time. And as a scholar, I'm really interested in the ways in which he wanted to use art to advance political causes. I think that's a really important way in which Black people have gained equal rights. And in one way, ways in which Black and Jewish people have worked together to advance civil rights.
Yes.
I'm thinking about the anti-lynching exhibitions that occurred in the 1930s, that were, cooperations between Black and Jewish communities. So, I consider myself to be someone who, I'm an expert on Irma Stern, but more broadly, I'm studying art of the African and Jewish diasporas. Mm-hmm. So my new project is looking at a Black artist from Chicago named William Edward Scott, and his paintings of Jewish Chicagoans. So with Irma Stern, I was studying a Jewish artist who painted Black people. And now I'm looking at a Black American artist who painted Jewish people. So Scott was a member of the Chicago Renaissance. He was based in Chicago, and he did a lot of murals. He did some very interesting murals within a church, in which he kind of did what you were talking about earlier, not choosing not to paint biblical figures as, European white people, and instead to either paint them as Black, or to paint them as Middle Eastern, and how revolutionary that was for him to be doing that. But he also painted portraits of Jewish people. And I'm trying to understand how many of those he painted. I have some very dear friends who have some in their private collection. And I can't help but think that other people have works in their family collections as well. I believe that it was partially how he was able to make a living in his time, was by painting the Jewish community. But, I'm curious about why Jewish Chicagoans chose Scott. Why would they choose this Black artist to paint? And so, in the process of doing this work, my larger study is about general interactions between Black and Jewish communities in Chicago during the Chicago Renaissance. So there were other artists who were working with like Ukrainian American artists, Jewish artists who were also writing and painting about the pogroms and anti-Semitism in Europe, and connecting with Black Chicago artists about, racism. So I think that that's such an important historic relationship that is worth us exploring and thinking about and meditating on as we, try to repair some of those fractures today, and to think about what we can continue to do together, because our work is clearly unfinished. There's a lot that we have to do. So how do we work together and use art to advance those causes?
Absolutely. And all too often we find our connection when we connect anti-Semitism and racism, but that's like working from the negative, right? We have so many beautiful cultural, like the sense of family and community and loyalty and devotion and strength and resilience, qualities in common. I'd so much rather be in that space than they're coming for us and they're coming for you kind of thing. And if you're Black and Jewish, you better really hide. I mean, it's just like it's not a very life-giving, generative place. I'd rather remember all those positive things and work from those commonalities. Would you tell us a little about your work with students at George Mason?
Yeah, and I think that your comments are a good segue into that, because first of all, I agree, and that's why I really talk about the overlapping diasporas. The concept of diasporas is really cool. That a Jewish person in Chicago could go to Uzbekistan, and there might be some linguistic differences, but at the same time of year, they're all going to sit down at a Passover Seder and talk about their deliverance from slavery. I think that that's really powerful. Same thing in the African diaspora. I can go to Brazil and, eat certain dishes, and they're going to feel like dishes that my mother made. And that's because, this awful thing of human enslavement happened, but one of the things that came out of that was that our amazing culture was spread out throughout the world. And so you can connect to people who are Black across the diaspora over shared food or shared culture, or the response to these traumatic events. And so I think that's a really powerful way of connecting with people. And that's the context in which I'm working with students at George Mason University. I have some students who have on their own decided that they wanted to have deeper connections between Black and Jewish communities, and have extended, a hand to our Mason Hillel, and Hillel has been so wonderful in responding. And this Black and Jewish students have come together to talk about mutual areas of concern and issues and how they can work together. We have Black students who go to Israel with Mason Hillel on various trips. And for me, I think that's really important for our students, not only to have the opportunity to travel, but to travel with other Jewish people and to see this country up front and really gain a deeper understanding of the conflict there by being on the ground.
That's awesome. Wow.
So it's been really fun for me to see students grow as leaders when they have these experiences. So much of the work that we do in international education is about leadership development. Once you go and you travel and you see a different place, you look at your own community in such a different way, and you see everything that's wrong that you want to fix. Nice. So getting students on the plane is about opening their minds and expanding their horizons, but it's also about leadership development. So a lot of our students are really excited about that. And many of those students have gone on to win prestigious fellowships to go overseas. One of the students was working with me on a project called Black Lives Next Door, where we've been doing research on the Black community and its and how it was displaced as George Mason University was founded. And there's a Rosenwald School that is located right behind. Yeah, and so that school, Rosenwald schools, were funded partially through the philanthropy of Julius Rosenwald, who was a prominent member of the Chicago Jewish community.
Yeah.
And so, you know, right in our own backyard, there's this powerful example of Black Jewish collaboration that's only exists as a sign. There's a street sign and no one really understands how much that means to Fairfax. So we're doing all this work to help rehabilitate that and integrate that back into the George Mason University narrative. So that's a little bit about what I'm doing at Mason right now.
So cool. Wow. I love to bring the teens from the synagogue out to see it and learn more. I mean, you know, and for me, I'm originally from the West Coast, and I served in Atlanta before coming to Alexandria, and I definitely know all about the Rosenwald schools, but I forget that this was the South. Right?
Yeah.
Yeah. You know, like, doesn't feel like it after living in Georgia, but this part of Virginia. Yeah.
Yeah. I'm a West Coaster as well. So,
right. Into Stanford, right?
Yeah. And I'm from Southern California. So, all of this is really new for me. Even though I've been out here for 18 years, it's still very hard to understand if you weren't raised in Northern Virginia. And I think that's a really important reason why you're doing the work that you're doing at Bethel, and why Audrey is doing this work with the Alexandria Community Remembrance Project, is that it's so easy to forget. And I'm very glad that we're changing many of the names in the area and moving away from fetishizing and memorializing the Confederacy.
We didn't get to that connection. Yeah. But we still have to, we can't wipe it away. We still have to remember that this was a place, you know, that Alexandria was a place where enslaved people were bought and sold. One of the biggest.
We can't let that go. And so that's why Audrey's work is so important, to put that front and center in Old Town. And you know, the monument that's at like South Washington, the monument to the Confederate dead, you know, like these are markers that tell us about the place in which we're living. And we have to really think about, you know, you drive past it every day, but what does it actually mean?
Right. Oh, LaNitra, it's Audrey. Yeah, thank you. Our Appomattox statue has been removed. Yeah, but for many years, I mean, it was the statue that you drove by, and and it's like you're saying, there is a connection there between what's happening in South Africa and the removal of their memorials. And so thank you for bringing up that connection. And I did want to mention a question that we had in the chat from Holly, who said, LaNitra, I'm sorry if you covered this, but what was the personal origin of your interest in the artists of the Black and Jewish diasporas?
Thank you, Holly, a dear colleague and friend of many years, for coming to this lecture. I'm so glad that you asked two questions. One was about whether or not that you said the portraits were almost anthropological. Yes, absolutely. Irma Stern read and was friends with Leo Frobenius, a famous German anthropologist / ethnologist. And so she was certainly replicating that type of painting of types of people. So what you're seeing there is correct. And then, you know, the origins of my interest in the artists of the Black and Jewish diasporas. So Irma Stern, I discovered by accident in the Duke University Library in graduate school in a catalog. And when I saw her name, it did not sound particularly South African to me. So as I traced back her background, I realized that there was a bigger story there. And I really only intended to write a dissertation about her and then, you know, move on to something else. But I've always been interested in the Black Jewish connection. And so I saw that was understudied in my field. There's usually mentions of this relationship, but not necessarily, lots of full length, scholarly texts that really probe, some of these relationships. And so I thought it was important to do that. And then just one other thing that connected me to this topic was that my mother attended Tennessee State University in the 60s. And at the time, there were many German Jewish refugee scholars who came to the United States and were not given visas by many of the top universities. But the HBCUs noticed that these scholars were in distress, and they gave them visas to teach. And they brought these scholars to HBCUs where they were the tops in their field in Europe. And so it dramatically improved the quality of the education at historically Black colleges, trained many of the next generation of leaders in a variety of fields. But most importantly, these scholars got to the American South, saw eerie parallels to Nazi Germany, and said, you must speak out against this injustice. And were many times the catalyst behind student protest. So I think it was just a very poignant example of how important these collaborations are, and how, HBCUs, who don't usually have a reputation as being particularly international, were extraordinarily international from the beginning, and also stood up in a very important moment and gave these scholars a home. And we are still reaping the benefits of those scholars. So my mother took math classes from many of those scholars. She had recollections of them really investing in her and treating her as a smart young woman with potential, which isn't always the case when Black students go to white universities. So, I always remembered that example, and I just thought, gosh, like there's so many examples of that. And many African-American artists studied under German Jewish refugees, art teachers in HBCUs. So there's that artistic connection is there as well.
Thank you. That's a goosebumps when you told that story. It's one of the coolest stories in American history, is how HBCUs saved the lives of scholars. I really have goosebumps. It's one of my favorite chapters. Yeah.
Yeah, it's so very important. And, I don't think that enough people understand the real impact that particular situation had on Black people in general and on our country.
Yeah, sure. Do you have any more questions, Audrey?
That was our last question, and we're getting close to the close of our evening, but I have to say that my phone has been lit up with people who are on the Zoom who have said this is such a wonderful conversation, and the two of you were perfect together, and that they learned so much. And so I think that this was a wonderful evening, and I thank you both, LaNitra, for sharing your research, and David for being the perfect moderator for this evening. And I think you two shared so much information and things that we haven't thought about, and parallels that we haven't made. And I think now more than ever in the times that we're in, we need to look at the commonalities and instead of the differences. And so I thank you for being, again, a part of our ACRP family. And I'd love to have you back to just do a lecture on the HBCUs and the scholars. I think that would be a fascinating topic as well that people don't know a lot about. So in the chat, again, people are saying thank you for the great comment, the great presentation, and I look forward to seeing you again, and hopefully seeing you at some of our other ACRP events. And before we conclude tonight, I do want to remind our audience about one event we have coming up next week, on March 30th, when we will have Ebony Davis back to give us an update on the Virginia Theological Seminary reparations program, and that will be at 7 p.m. And that's free, and it will be on Zoom. So we hope that we'll see many of you again there at that lecture. And again, I want to give my sincere thanks to both LaNitra Berger and David Spinrad for tonight. It was a wonderful presentation and a great evening with both of you. So thank you.